guys, we are back with episode 2 of our, as of yet, untitled talk show, game, whatever you want to call it. Today's topic is analog versus digital everything. Recording, gear, whatever. We'll kind of get into a little bit of everything and just kind of see where this thing goes. And I'm sure it'll come off the rails at some point. So let's see where we go. And we're off. So who's gonna kick this off? I know Joe's got a lot to say about this. So.
This is a pretty passionate topic, Joe. So Joe, what do you how do you feel about digital recordings or digital music versus analog recording?
Well, I mean, the way I feel about it is the album was originally recorded and intended for. So, obviously anything that was released after the mid to late 1980s, I mean, pretty much all that stuff, we'll use the 90s as the cutoff point. The majority of stuff, I believe, was all recorded digitally. I think the first Pearl Jam album from '91, that might have still been tape. But, being into collecting records and all that kind of stuff, I would say I find it a little tedious now how albums that I bought, when I say albums, I mean CDs, stuff that I bought 10, 15, 20 years ago, how it's being digitally remastered when it was already digitally mastered the first time. So how do you digitally remaster something that was already mastered once digitally? So I don't know. To me, I feel like it's just a cash grab of buying the same. But again, I'm the same guy that's got 50 different copies of the same albums, including one that I bought today. But I don't know. A lot of stuff I always say, I like buying it the way it was originally issued. I mean, it's a different story if you have something that was repackaged with new stuff in it. That's cool and all, but I'm not a big fan of stuff that was recorded in the year 2020 digitally that's put onto a record that's being hailed as, oh, this is how it was intended to be recorded when it was digital and a record, and you can't get more analog than something that's on an LP that's analog.
So do you feel a lot of cans of worms right there that I can definitely dive into? But Rob, so do you feel like analog is better than digital, or do you just feel like it's like it should be if it was recorded on digital, then it should be digitally formatted on release?
I would say, however it was recorded or mastered should be the way it's released. It's like, I mean, a lot of the music I enjoy listening to is, from the 1960s, 1970s. Obviously, digital didn't exist then. But on the other hand, a lot of that stuff, when we were all growing up in the 80s and 90s, a lot of that stuff was already remastered once it was put on CD. So I'm kind of used to hearing that on a CD. But when it comes to, especially, old Capitol Beatle records, to me, I mean, my go-to fad stuff is listen to the original LPs, which, they're tougher to find now. I mean, they made them pretty much from 64 to 1988, and they made them on cassettes. But I'm just not a big fan of newer stuff that is thrown on vinyl for the sake of being on vinyl when I don't even know what the quality standards are, because I've talked to a lot of people buying new albums that are actually defective. I've talked to a few people where they have skips in them, and a lot of these new records, I think a lot of the plants where they're mostly made in Eastern Europe now. I got a couple that Capitol LPs, newer artists that are actually made here, but it's odd that.
I think Joe hit his mute button again. You hit mute. There you go.
We there? Yeah, the screen goes black. But yeah, I'm just not a big fan of going into record stores now and seeing that there's a section that says new reissues. That's kind of like an oxymoron. That's kind of like jumbo shrimp.
Yeah, but doesn't it kind of allow? So obviously, especially when you're talking about the older stuff that was in the original releases, right? I know there's a lot of stuff out there, but I think a lot of people also find it. I mean, I know that's part of the joys of the record, of that whole collection thing is the hunts, right? Some people don't really want to deal with the hunt; they just want to go and buy something and they want to know what's on the shelf. So in that sense, I feel like reissues actually kind of help reach more.
Yeah, it caters to a different part of the market, I think. There's the hardcore guys like yourself, and then there's the guys that just want something now.
Oh, that's good. I think we had a sidebar on that. I mean, there's nothing wrong with. There's a lot of albums that were reissued 40, 50 years ago that are impossible to find now, like the Stooges, for example. I mean, those are from 1969. A lot of people didn't buy them. To find an original one, you're going to spend hundreds of dollars when you can buy a brand new reissued one, which is fine for $20 and it plays perfectly. I just find it difficult to accept when again, I'll use the Beatles stuff for example. They'll reissue a box set, remix it, and saying, "Oh, this LP sounds better than the CD," but CD is on a digital format and the master's digital. So why would somebody buy this new album on an LP where I can only play it at home, and then if I want to stream it, I got to download a code? It just, to me, it just boggles my mind. But
I think kind of like you said, I think you kind of got into a few different things there too. If it's a totally new mix where it's remastered and remixed, I think that's worth checking out. But if it's just a straight, port to a different format or something, like you said, if they're gonna just remaster something like the Pearl Jam album, for example, you're gonna go remaster something from 1994 or 1995, unless it's gonna be dramatically upgraded, different, whatever. Why bother? I'm
yeah,
kind of with you on that.
Yeah, what they were doing in the 90s, and again, this could be a sidebar too, is when CDs came out. I mean, they always say the CD age started around 1985, even though I think the first commercial CDs came out in 82, 83. The first ones were made in Japan or West Germany, and they were really expensive. I mean, I know we've talked about it before, especially like with metal, when Metallica albums were coming out. Most people didn't. I think Elektra Records did put those albums out on CDs, but nobody was able to afford them. Everybody would buy them on CDs or cassettes. And to make that even more confusing, they would put those masters out on CDs, but they were analog. So if you played them on a CD, you would actually hear a hissing noise. But for some reason, the CDs that were mastered in West Germany or Japan, because when that format came out, there were no factories here in the United States. They were able to print the booklets and the cases. The actual discs were made in Japan and West Germany, which is now Germany. But in the 90s, when they were going through, that's when they really got the format perfected. What they were doing was, compared to the older CDs that were really flat, the newer ones, because they always say with an analog recording, it's warmer. It doesn't sound out as processed. But, comparing an old analog recording to a digital recording, it's a lot more cleaner, crisper. But when they were remastering stuff in the 90s, a lot of times what they were doing, and Eugene would know more about this technical aspect of it, they would just boost up the fidelity to make the CD sound louder. So just because they were louder didn't make them sound better. But when you talk about digital analog too, that opens up a whole nother discussion of, what sounds better to someone. Everyone's got different tastes and stuff. I mean, you can even look at photography, for example, especially with digital photos. You can put on as many filters or anything as you want on stuff now. One person might think it looks great, and another person might say, "Oh, it looks distorted." But back to the first question, I mean, I kind of like listening to albums, LPs, right, the way they are originally issued. So, growing up in the 80s and 90s, a lot of those albums I bought new, I've seen the 90s, I bought them on CDs. But there's a couple records in my collection or albums I have in the collection that are on LP, for example. I think I have Offspring Americana that came out in 98, 99, and I actually did find that at a record store that's long gone now on an LP at the time, which I don't think I've ever seen another one since. But that was more of a gimmick. I mean, they still made records in the 90s, but the thing I don't like what they do with a lot of them now is they're very heavy and overweight, and they always brag about 180 gram, 200 gram vinyl. And back in the 60s, when they were making high quality records, or European and British records, they weren't heavy for the sake of being heavy. In the 70s, they started making records really, really flimsy. RCA called it Dynaflex, which was just a nice way of saying we just made it cheaper, like you see on a Poland Springs bottle now. But in the 80s, what you had was, when the format was getting phased out, Capitol and a couple other labels, they were actually making records thin again, but they were on translucent vinyl, which was they marketed it as saying it was virgin vinyl. It wasn't, melted down old records that didn't sell. So I don't know if I went too deep into the conversation or avoided the questions, but I mean you can talk about this stuff for hours, really.
Well, yeah, and I think you bring up we'll go off on a slight about like how like you feel like records should be on the whole ethics of remastering and remixing something, right? Like it's interesting because like you talk with Metallica, right? And the album that comes to mind is Justice for All. And everyone's always like, "Why don't you guys ever go and remix that thing?" Because the mix is raw. It's a very raw mix, and they've come out and they've said that we did kind of push down the bass because it's known as an album that doesn't have a whole lot of bass in it. But when they're approached about like, hey, why don't you guys go remix and remaster, and they're like, nah, 'cause that's how it was recorded. That's how
it is, yeah.
I wish the Beatles stuff was more like that because I always joke around saying now, well, somebody actually told me the reason why they reissue stuff all the time, not only because it makes money. I think after a certain amount of time, stuff can become public domain. So that's why I think they went through a lot of this Beatles stuff now because it's all at least 50 years old. But like especially with Metallica stuff, I could see that, and I'm not as familiar as you guys are with this, but with that Justice for All mix, that was the way it was mixed, and you don't want to go back and rewrite history and make another mix of it.
Right.
But on the other hand, you have a whole generation of people coming into this music that aren't used to that, and they would like to hear what isn't on there. So it's like a lot of other stuff that people take personally. I mean, you start messing around with things like that, you're gonna throw people up in arms somehow.
Yeah, and I think, actually, I didn't even think of it, but I think Injustice for All is a really interesting point on this whole thing because of the bass debate. Where I know there's a lot of guys that feel super hardcore one way that, like you said, you can't remix this, you can't touch it. It is what it is. It's frozen in time. But I know there's a lot of guys, Metallica fans and not, that would like to hear it with a full bass track too. So it's, I for one wouldn't mind hearing it. I think it'd be kind of cool. I've heard some of the like fan-made versions of it, and it's not bad. And obviously, stuff sounds good live. So it does work, but I'm kind of I don't know. I guess I'm kind of stuck in the ways too, where this is how we grew up. This is what it is. So it's just what we're used to hearing.
I mean, another debate you always have, because it's weird because this might have always existed with audio files and everything, but nowadays you have everything at your fingertips. You can go and hear different mixes of stuff. I mean, even 10, 15, 20 years ago, you didn't have any of this stuff. I mean, there was a time where I think, actually, not going back with a history lesson, but in 1968, that was the first year the American record labels, they got rid of mono. Mono was the dominant format because nobody really had home stereo systems. You either played records on little portable units or you had a piece of furniture that were stereos, but by the 68 and up until especially the 80s, and obviously had digital formats, nobody wanted the old stuff. They just kind of forgot about it. And I think a lot of retail stores, they would just, I mean, at that time, I think records LP sold for about $250 to $350, and the stereo ones were $1 more, which is a lot of money. If something was $250 and you're charging an extra $1, you're talking almost 50% more. It didn't make a difference because you're playing on some cheap 2-watt, Mickey Mouse stereo system. A lot of that stuff changed, but it's the other thing. I think a lot of things will always want to get something that isn't as easy to get just for the sake of getting it. So, I think Mike and I were talking about it yesterday. I mean, I've been collecting records now, I think, since about 95. And I remember going into a record shop that's still around today. And I do remember seeing Load, Reload, and Garage Inc. on records. They were available. They were imports, though. I think they were always making records in Europe. They never stopped making them. Here in the United States, I mean, we were all born in 83 and 84. So by the time we got into buying music, everything we were buying was on CDs and cassettes. And I mean, I didn't buy a lot of cassettes. I bought a few of them. But I mean, pretty much from 94 onward, 95, I mean, everything I bought was on. I mean, I still buy CDs today. I mean, to me, I still feel that's the best format. I mean, sure, I'm a big record collector. I buy records all the time, but compact disc is still my go-to format. I mean, I mean, this stuff sounds perfectly, but it is cool to have the original LPs of it. I just find it, as he said before, it's a cash grab where now they're reissuing albums on cassettes. Well, what's the quality of the cassette? I mean, you don't have many factories making these things anymore. And I mean, can I play these things? I mean, it's funny. I just went to my local record shop earlier today to. Oh Jesus! There that goes. Buy another copy of this. I can get it. But I mean, something like that. I mean, it was made to be on a record and everything, but it's cool to have it. I mean, I have it on CD. I have so many other different versions of it, but he was telling me that there's a lot of younger people. What they'll do. I remember the first couple times I went there. I've been going there pretty much every week for the last 4 or 5 years now. He was saying he had a lot of customers that go in, buy these new records, especially with Record Store Day. They buy stuff and they never even open them. They just like hang them on the wall. I mean, I don't even want to say how much this record was I bought today, and I'm gonna play it as if it was 1966. I mean, it was made to be played. We're talking 54 years later, but I don't think a lot of people do that. I think right now I would say like the vinyl. It's fun. One store I go to, a guy reminds me of me 10 years from now. He gets always aggravated when a hipster, as we call him, goes in and says vinyls. He calls records vinyls, which that's an interesting thing too to see. Every age group calls a record a different adjective. Some people call them LPs. Some people call them records. Some people call them vinyl albums. So, but I didn't mean to cut Eugene off. You were saying?
So like I think going back to a little bit what we're talking about from the mixing and the mastering engineer perspective, right? So a lot of those records that were originally intended to be released on records, vinyl terminology, like the Beatles back then, that would be the printing process of that music would be part of that decision-making process. When you print, depending on that vinyl machine, that actual printing process, a little bit of it does impart its own character and sound. So from a mixing engineer point of view, like you would factor that into the way you were mixing and you're mastering the album. Whereas today, you have on the digital aspect, you factor in that you're doing your mixing and your mastering all in the box, and you're making those decisions so that when you print it out digitally and streaming, how much you want. So I think there is some truth. Now, in terms of what the casual listener will hear in those differences, that's to be debated because the difference truly is very very subtle. A lot of times, it can be significant, but it also can be subtle. So,
Well, the other thing too, and I also realize this too, being into this stuff, and I know we're all ex-car guys too, but a lot of stuff you also got to look at, especially we'll use older stuff, 60s, 70s, Beatles, Stones. Rock was pop music. That was popular music. People didn't really overanalyze this stuff like we do with a lot of stuff today, whether it's movies, music. I mean, even look at today. I mean, the music industry is totally different. I mean, we'll use pop music, for example. I mean, no one's really going, I mean, I know we all have certain artists nowadays we don't mind, but no one's really writing super in-depth reviews and overanalyzing, like, what's the songwriting that this pop singer is doing on something. Nowadays, I mean, pop music's more of like a background thing. But back even 50 years ago, nobody thought anybody would be talking about it. I mean, one of my favorite groups, The Who, Pete Townsend, didn't even think the band was going to be around 2 years later, and then, half the band's still touring in the year 2020. So it's amazing to see stuff like that, like pop culture, cultural references. We talk about that stuff all the time. No one expects this stuff's going to last that long, but yeah, it is interesting to see because I do know with a lot of the American stuff that was mastered back in the 60s, especially like the Beatle record I bought today, it's a stereo one, which is fake stereo, so which means on the left you have your vocals and on the right you'd have your guitar, bass, your drums. In those days, a lot of this stuff I believe was all recorded on 4-track. Like the Beatles didn't start using 8-track until '68 with the White Album. I mean, that doesn't mean anything nowadays since everybody, records digitally. But yeah, a lot of this stuff. I mean, I know a lot of the American record labels, they would compress stuff as much as possible just to make it louder. Or like these Beatle records, most purists would, spit at them because they're horrible. Because I mean, they have fake stereo, they're drenched in reverb, but they were just made for kids, like teenagers, to play them until the next thing came on. Nobody ever anticipated you'd be talking about bands 50 years later. And I think we probably have the same conversation 20 years from now, discussion Metallica stuff. Because, I mean, it's crazy to think that Metallica stuff today in the year 2020 is the same way, we viewed Beatles stuff 20 years earlier. So, stuff holds up for a reason. And, I put both those bands in the same category. But, yeah, it is interesting to see how different stuff is mixed, and it's all everyone's different take on things.
Well, let me shift gears on you here and go the complete opposite side of this talk here. If we dive, I want to kind of get both your guys' opinions here and blindside you a little bit with this one. If you go to the modern stuff, these guys that are doing like pure digital recording, kind of like what we mess around with, where they're not even in the same room. You can have guys all over the country record their parts on a computer in their living room and send them around and do whatever they want to do. There's some like extreme metal bands out there that they'll come up with these crazy blast beats that are almost not physically possible for an actual drummer to play real time live, or they will absolutely just struggle with trying to play these like ridiculous beats and things like that. But you could do it on the computer, and you could do things you can't do in real life. I guess like, Huge and I were talking about like, synth the other day and like all these crazy things you could do with like keyboards and synth and just weird noises that you would not be able to make otherwise. That's a whole completely different side of things, but do you think that's good, bad, indifferent? Do you care? Do you not care? I know it's kind of two separate things there, but like, let's just kind of talk with like, okay, you could do something in a computer that you couldn't do in real life, and it's cool. You can put it to an album and you can put it out there, but you can't really go play some of this stuff live. So is that cool, or is that doing more damage than good? You know what I mean?
I think that's a.
Okay, let Eugene go first.
Yeah, so I'll jump on that one because I know that is actually a favorite now on a lot of when I can figure it out. Whether on it's live drums are better, or all the sample replacement that happens in metal music. I mean, it's almost.
Right.
I guarantee almost any metal album you listen, modern metal album you listen to, even if it's your biggest bands, they have some level of sample replacement of the kick and snare.
Yeah.
And that's a standard. And it's because to do those blast beats evenly and at volume, it's very difficult to keep that going. On the track, to keep that tempo and that feeling, there's a lot of sample replacement that goes on. There's also a lot of grid aligning that happens. My personal opinion on it is it's the creative process, right? So it's something that, I mean, case in point ourselves, right? Like, I can't play the drums from scratch. We can't play the drums from scratch, really, right? We're trying to learn it. But I think in those instances, it's okay to utilize program drums and stuff like that so you can still have that creative outlet. Now, we still want to learn how to do that stuff.
Right.
But I think there's as long as you say that you're being creative and like we openly admit, like, we can't play drums. All those drums that we back to, most of them, except for the ones where you're playing on the easier tracks, those aren't us. That's a drum machine. That's only for us.
Right.
And I think as long as people are open about it and they say, yeah, I played all the drums, I think that's fine.
Yep.
But I think where the problem comes into place is when someone says, no, I played that, but they really did.
Right. Trying to pass it off as something it's not. I agree with that completely. I think it's cool. I mean, it works for the albums, and I think it's neat. And if these dudes can actually figure it out and learn how to play it live, more power to them.
Because when you talk to some, to some guitar, like when you start the songwriting process, now we're going down in a whole different tangent. When you start the songwriting process, a lot of times you have to think about it in terms of, am I going to have to play this thing live?
Right.
Or am I just writing a song just for the song itself, the music itself, right? Because there's a difference. You listen to a lot of bands, actual bands that play live music, and that has to factor into their process. Because as they're writing, you can look at a modern track count. You're up into the 150 tracks for modern music. And as they're writing all the stuff, they have to think about, like, okay, how do I actually play this thing live? But then you have other people like Ola and Beard albums, which is like he's never going to play those live, so he can write it however he wants to write it.
Right. Exactly.
I think it's also part of the decision making process when you actually start writing.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that.